When you think about environmental damage, you might imagine pollution, birds going extinct, or industrial smokestacks sending black fumes into the atmosphere. But there's something that sits right below our feet, invisible to most, but on which everything relies, that is at risk of disappearing entirely. And if you're a frequent visitor of this channel, you'll be able to guess right away that I'm referring to the soil. If you're new here, welcome back to the channel. I'm Taylor, and I help gardeners explore low-cost, sustainable, and regenerative growing techniques that increase yields without the waste of modern gardening. But in this video, I want to highlight a very real crisis that our planet is facing. So let's get into it. Now, I'll say that I want to give this data as simply as possible because I'm highly aware, first of all, that there are many crises in our world, many of which deserve attention. And so my goal is not to give you just another thing to worry about and add to the noise. But secondly, I also know that there are many ways to interpret this data. And of course, that's what I'm going to be doing here. And then I'm going to be packaging it and presenting it to you in such a way that is meant to convince you of my point of view. But of course, you are entitled to your own point of view. In fact, you're more than entitled. You kind of need to be forming your own opinion on this stuff because frankly, if you only ever hear my finished thoughts at this moment, and then you just blindly accept that you may or may not do anything about it. And even if you do take some sort of action, you might wake up months or years down the road and think, do I actually believe this? So there you go, disclaimer made. In this video, I'm looking specifically at how much topsoil is lost each year, how it's being lost, and what the implications of that loss are going forward. And while I know that this is a worldwide concern, I live in the United States, so that's where much of my concern currently lies. And that's where a majority of the practices are that I'll be critiquing. So topsoil, what is it? Why should we care? Well, there are four main layers of soil on the earth, plus a bonus layer of sorts. Starting at the bottom, we've got the bedrock, which is solid, unweathered rock, on top of which sits parent material, which is bedrock broken apart a bit, on top of which is the subsoil that contains minerals that have leached out from the upper layers, and is typically pretty dense material, helps with water retention and drainage. And then we've got our topsoil, perhaps intuitively referring to the uppermost layer of the Earth's soil. And this is where the decomposed organic matter, broken down minerals, and tons of microorganisms live. It's where our plants largely grow, and it's created in part by the bonus layer of the Earth's soil horizons, which is just called the organic layer. And this stuff is like natural mulch, plant debris, decomposing leaves, insects, decaying animals. But that topsoil is the key thing to our survival as humans because it's basically the foundation of our food system. And maybe more importantly, it's sort of the foundation of all life on Earth. Plants, animals, insects, pollinators, microorganisms, we all rely on that soil, whether directly or indirectly, for survival. It also stores carbon as plants absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store the carbon in their roots, which then feeds microbes, and those eventually die and reimpart their stored carbon into the topsoil. So where does topsoil come from exactly? In nature, it's said that topsoil generates at approximately 1/10 of a millimeter per year. And that occurs through subsoil weathering and breaking down into smaller particles, which microorganisms colonize, break down further, and carry upward gradually, and then mixing with the decomposing organic layer, further processing, and then there we got topsoil. And it's incredible how complex this process actually is. So if you think about the way that we got the majority of our topsoil, we're looking at tectonic plates shifting, grinding, water traveling downward, freezing, thawing, microorganisms doing their thing for eons. The point is, at best, nature gets an inch of topsoil pumped out every 100 years. So we've got this vitally important, valuable substance that all life on Earth relies on, and it gets made slowly. Unfortunately, to put it very mildly, we're losing this soil. Now, maybe you've heard this before or maybe not, but either way, numbers are pretty easy to become numb to. So when I say that our topsoil in the US is being depleted at an estimated rate of 1 millimeter per year on the conservative side, it's really hard to appreciate what that might actually result in or what that would look like. Fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, we have one clear image of what that results in American history, in an event called the Dust Bowl, which occurred a little over 100 years ago. Agricultural practices in the 1920s and 30s, such as deep plowing and intensive tillage, replacement of grasslands, and agricultural overexpansion onto poor land, resulted in one of the most devastating losses of topsoil in American history, with over 850 million tons blown off the southern plains in 1935 alone. This was equivalent to 8 tons of soil per US resident at the time, and an estimated 75% of topsoil was stripped across 100 million acre land. Now, the Dust Bowl was such an extreme and obviously devastating event that the US government stepped in to figure out ways to mitigate and remediate the damage. And this came in the form of mild yet sweeping agricultural reforms, such as encouraging contour plowing, terracing, and planting trees to reduce wind erosion. They also encouraged farmers to practice cover cropping and a few other techniques, all of which are valuable, but don't replenish really what was lost exactly. And today, erosion is still claiming topsoil, albeit in slightly different ways. Tillage is still commonplace in conventional agriculture. Deforestation and natural habitat removal are still happening across the country. Even urban development and construction projects contribute to topsoil loss, since when homes are built, the first step in prepping the land is just to wipe away the topsoil to level the site. And if you're growing on residential land, you've probably faced the reality of starting with bad gardening soil that needs some work. Or you've opted to install raised beds, which is a legitimate solution. But there are other solutions, which we'll get to a little bit later in this video, that actually focus on replenishing the topsoil itself. The question that we need to be asking is, where is this loss of topsoil taking us? Well, from my perspective, and I don't think that this is much of a leap, we're heading toward greater food insecurity, nutrient-depleted food, and severe economic risk. The fact that farmland is degrading and losing topsoil far faster than it's able to replenish it means that if nothing changes, we're on a timer. And there are many different estimates here, so it's hard to know exactly what timeline we're truly facing. But currently, were nothing to change in our agricultural practices, some of the experts are saying that we're looking at 2050 for nearly complete loss of topsoil. And the good news is that things are changing. It's not as though everyone is just plowing ahead, pardon the expression, head down, not paying attention. Many attempts are being made to push back the time horizon. However, what many people feel, myself included, is that it's not really enough to just kick the can down the road, which is what our country seems to be very comfortable doing in a variety of spheres. I'm interested in solutions, specifically solutions that can be explored now. And there are two components that need to go hand in hand here in my mind. The first thing is obviously our practices when it comes to the way that we farm. And the second thing has to do with consumer expectations. So starting with our practices, I said a moment ago that when houses are built in America, standard practice is to scrape away the topsoil, level the site, and build the house, which is great for creating a stable structure in which people can live. But the next step is typically to finish things off with the landscaping equivalent of a bone-dry, flavorless birthday cake slathered with plain white frosting. I'm referring, of course, to the sod lawn that contractors roll out across the non-existent soil. Now, when we first moved to this house, the lawn was way past its prime, and while it grew thick and healthy in some places, in others it was patchy and weedy at best. When we first dug up a patch of lawn to install our first garden bed, we had no idea what we were doing, so we didn't even try to improve the quality of the soil before planting into it. We just set up our tomatoes and watered them once in a while, and needless to say, that soil didn't have much to offer our plants. We didn't have much of a yield that year. But over the next few years, we explored many natural soil building techniques: sheet mulching, compost making, homemade liquid ferments and teas, cover crops, adding biochar. And after another year of growing, these practices had drastically improved the quality of our soil. So much, in fact, that I'd guess it was the best the soil had felt in decades. Now, it's not as though this was easy to do. We'd improved and drastically increased our topsoil, but it took a fair amount of effort, and we were doing it, most of it by hand. But it was possible. And there's something that I noticed when it comes to many amazing farmers in my area and those across the country that I've been able to observe across the internet. And that is that many of these farmers are growing on a scale that would be considered minuscule to most conventional growers. Rather than growing on tens of thousands of acres as a standard practice for conventional commodity crop growers, the regenerative growers that I've observed intentionally limit their growing space to as much as a few thousand acres for livestock and as little as a tenth of an acre for fruit and vegetable market gardeners. And even on these small-scale growing operations, with a lot of intentionality and strategic marketing, farmers are able to feed a decent amount of people and earn a living. And the reality is that many of these soil building practices can scale, but the effort and education required to advance them seems to be outpaced by the losses caused by the big agricultural operations. I'm speaking in generalities here, and I know that this is not true across the board. What I'm drawing attention to is that there are a few key things that I believe will need to characterize the future of agriculture if we're going to sustain and replenish the soil that we're losing. First, and there's a lot of headway in this direction already, at least in my part of the country, Washington State, but I think that the future is more, smaller, better. So more farmers Smaller farms, better practices. The industrial era, huge manufacturing plant, centralized, no-name style is and needs to fade into obsolescence. And instead, knowing by name the individuals who are growing your food needs to become more commonplace. Now, I'll admit that this is a challenging task, many of us, myself included, because we're simply not used to knowing our farmers. But getting to know them is a pretty worthy task, and one of the reasons for that is because of the ownership that it brings. I choose to support a local farm, Lazy R Beef, because I believe that Beth Robinette is growing in such a way that takes care of the soil and leads to regeneration. She and her family practice rotational grazing for their beef and lamb, a practice that is an incredible way of managing the land so that the soil gets better year after year. Another way to participate in this more smaller, better revolution is to do what most of you are already doing now, growing some of your own food. And in fact, it might be some of you who decide to expand your growing operations so that you can provide food for your neighbors, your broader community, your city even. With many of the techniques that we demonstrate on this channel, the possibility to scale up your growing operation for the sake of increasing your yields becomes very real. We actually need more home gardeners who have access to possibly unused land to take a step forward toward contributing to locally available produce. Another thing that happens when people take ownership over growing some of their own food, at least, is that they become more aware of the cost to produce such food. And this brings us to the second part in this section, consumer expectations. It's my belief that as remarkable as many of these industrial practices are in generating large amounts of food with very little, for little, as is the case with most shortcuts, there's a bill that needs to be paid somewhere. And that bill can come either now or later. If we do nothing, some estimate that we will have 25 years before a significant loss of food. At that point, food prices will have already raised substantially along the way, not overnight, but we'll find ourselves with a greater deficit to make up when it comes to replenishing our topsoil. On the other hand, the more that we can pay that cost up front, pay more to the farmers who are growing smaller and better, the lighter the financial burden will actually feel in the long run. The problem is that we've been lulled into some false expectations when it comes to the actual cost of food. And so, especially over the past few years with the supply chain and climate-related issues exposing the fragility of our systems, we've begun to feel suffocated at the rising cost of food. And no doubt this is also due to the mega corporations who are blaming phantom issues and then raising prices when they don't need to for the sake of making more money. Egg prices, for example, have been infamously out of control over the past year, and the leading cause that experts point to is the bird flu. When there's an outbreak of avian flu, flocks are culled and egg production goes down. And then we're into the basics of supply and demand. Of course, if supply goes down, then the cost is going to go up. But what's sketchy is that whereas you'd expect profits to stay somewhat level for the US's biggest egg producer, Cal-Maine, the reality is that their profits tripled last year. Not their total revenue, their profits. In other words, it's not as though supply chain shocks and inflation and avian flu aren't to blame for the rising cost of food. It's that those words are kind of the new normal and are now being used against consumers to justify increased prices. So who would you rather pay higher prices to? The mega producers or the farmer a few miles down the road? It's obviously not as simple as I'm making it out to be here. I'm not saying that we need to tear down the whole system, but even gradual spending changes over the course of years will lead us at least closer to a more sustainable food system. As I wrap things up, ideally this video leaves you with equal parts hope and urgency. The loss of topsoil at the current rates is unsustainable. The ecological and economic risk of this loss is leading us toward discomfort at best and disaster at worst. But there are ways forward, and that begins with personal responsibility, in my opinion. As gardeners, any amount that you can participate in the process of restoring the soil is a step in the right direction. As consumers, any amount that you can find and support farmers who are growing using regenerative approaches is a huge step toward us recovering our soil. And for those of you who made it to the end, thank you for considering what I have to say here. I really enjoy getting to demonstrate these growing techniques that I'm talking about on this channel, but with the off season that we're in, it feels appropriate to discuss some of the more philosophical takes. This isn't the future of this channel, I believe, so don't worry if you mostly come here for the tutorials and overviews. We've got some cool stuff to share with you as we come to the close of the year and head into the new year. If you enjoyed this video, you'll want to check out this video on the problem with natural farming. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.